Hi everyone, welcome back to the Social Hotelier podcast with me, Sam-Erik. My guest is Robyn Woodhead. Robyn is a pioneering leader in responsible Antarctic tourism and passionate advocate for environmental stewardship. As a long-standing member and former chair of the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, she has helped shape sustainable tourism policies that protect Antarctica while inspiring global awareness of conservation and the shared responsibility to safeguard our planet's most fragile ecosystems. Robyn has been a guest on this show before, so if you are interested to see this episode that I think we recorded about 2 years ago, so just look up here, click there, and you will enjoy some very funny stories we shared about the price of Coca-Cola. I remember was one of the things we talked about, but that was more on the lighter side. But Robyn, so great to have you on board today. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks so much, Sam-Erik. It's lovely to see you again, and what a privilege to be here. So thank you.
You spent considerable time working around the polar regions. What first drew you personally and professionally to the Arctic and Antarctic?
It's a good question. I think it was madness. No, I'm only joking, because it is the continent of extremes. So I think that's what drew me to it originally. I was living in England at the time. And, the stories of the explorers of old, Shackleton and Cook and all of those polar legends are, a very ingrained part of the British culture. And so I was drawn to, and it was a very male-dominated area of exploration. And so I was drawn to see this stark, otherworldly place for myself. And I first went there in the year 2004 and 2005, nearly 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago. And I was trying to recreate Shackleton's expedition where they drove vehicles to the South Pole, and we didn't make it. So I sent my team home and ended up living in a tent on my own for almost 3 months. And I think that experience was what really gripped me to fall in love with this very otherworldly, surreal, extremely cold environment. It takes your system down to its primary functionality, to survive, and because it's a white environment, to appreciate everything. So it's almost like a relayering of self in such an extreme environment. So a very profound impact it had on me. And I couldn't understand why only the odd woman or polar explorer went to this very, very special place.
Yeah. So for listeners who may never have experienced what you have experienced, what is it about the polar environment that makes such a powerful place to study climate change and global systems? Because I think that's a very relevant topic that you're dealing with.
Yes, it is. And it does seem very, very far away from everybody's everyday life because it is so incredibly logistically complicated to get to and very expensive to access this environment purely because of those complex logistics. We've ended up in my 20 years of operating a polar business, we've had a lot of astronauts that visited us because it was close to studying what life would be like on a different planet. So I think that gives people an idea of that. But my opinion is we shouldn't be striving for alternative planets when we've got this perfectly good one. We need to heal the planet and to adapt to a changing climate. And so the Antarctic regions are very key to that. And the Antarctic and Arctic regions are essentially what regulates our temperatures as a planet, what regulates our sea level, and also things like, the jet stream and the impacts of the polar regions actually affect everyone, not just those living on coastal areas that will be affected by a 2-meter, say, sea level rise.
Yeah. Over the years that you had these tours, how many people have actually visited the region under program that you had?
That's a good question. I'll have to calculate it. But for example, this past season, we had 250 guests and we had 250 scientists that we flew in. So, and I've just sold that business 6 months ago. But for me, that was a very big part of what I wanted to achieve, was to work side by side with the scientific community and actually have the scientists that are doing the real work educate guests and make them become Antarctic ambassadors, so that when they go home, they spread the importance of conserving the region with other people. So for me, that
Yeah.
was fundamentally important. So we didn't have 250, 500 guests for 20 years. We built up to that.
Yeah.
So, we can just do the maths, and I'll get back to you with that figure for those
No,
interested. It's a
no,
good question,
I'm just trying to get
but
the
very
idea,
small
because
numbers, very
yeah,
small numbers.
yeah, and it's also the kind of people who want to see something which very because there's a curiosity and also a passion for to understand what is changing, and also about our planet, because
Yes.
they have seen most places in the world, but now this is something very unique that very few people uh, maybe take the time to go, or unless they want to go to the deepest level of a sea, or something very unusual thing. Yeah, but if the Arctic and Antarctica are the front line of climate change, why are the world political economic leaders still treating them as a distant scientific laboratories rather than as strategic priorities for humanity? I'm worried about that.
Yes. So actually, the interesting thing about the Antarctic specifically, and then I'll get to the Arctic in a moment,
Yeah,
because they have different governance structures. So the Antarctic, a quick history lesson, is governed by a thing called the Antarctic Treaty, which was actually originally signed in 1959 by 12 nations, and now in 2026 has 58 signatories. So actually, and everything has to be approved unanimously for it to pass. So essentially, it is the world's most effective coalition of governments where countries put aside their differences for the good of Antarctic conservation and science. So it shows, the actual phraseology behind the Antarctic Treaty is the continent must be used for only peaceful scientific purposes, bans military activity, and prohibits, at the time, it actually spoke about nuclear waste disposal and nuclear testing. But it's becoming more relevant today, right, with the fractured geopolitical environment we live in. Whereas the Arctic is not governed by a treaty. It has systems, but because it's about continental claims underneath the ocean that is the Arctic. So it's not a continent. So essentially, it's governed by a thing called the Arctic Council, and tourism is very well governed in the Arctic as well by something called IACO. But it's a very different and potentially slightly more volatile than the Antarctic in terms of the scramble for resources that is beginning to happen on our planet.
yeah. So the polar treaties have managed to avoid geopolitical conflicts in a region rich in resources. What can the rest of the world learn from that model of cooperation in today's increasingly fragmented global order?
So much. So I've been to Antarctic Treaty meetings, and I've been to COMNAT meetings, and I've been to, the tourism governance meetings. And essentially the essence of all of them is the same, where people that rule various regions of the planet put aside their own priorities for the good of humanity. So it's species thinking, and it's also species thinking in terms of managing biodiversity, managing sea ice loss, managing whales and krill, and so managing the full makeup of the environment. So a very successful example in the past was the creation of the world's largest marine protected area in the Ross Sea. And that's part of the reason why things like the international polar years have been created, to put collaboration lines in the sand so that governments, scientists, tourism bodies focus on that with intensity to achieve a greater level of global collaboration. And it really has done that. So it's actually a story of hope and an example to the rest of the world.
Yeah. So you were recently involved in the discussion preparing for the next international polar year. Is it 2032-33? What are the most
Correct.
important themes or insights that emerged from those conversations?
So it is the fifth international polar year. And sorry for all the history, but it's actually very interesting history. So, the previous 5 polar years were very significant in moving the dial forward with progressive change. For example, things like discovering of the ozone, hole in the ozone, that was done around an international polar year. The Antarctic Treaty itself was created through the impetus of scientific collaboration, data collection, environmental focus around a polar year. So what they are is essentially a reason to collaborate more closely. And in the last polar year in 2007-8, there were actually 200 projects across 60 nations.
Oh,
And
wow.
and this next polar year in 2032, 2033, and what we were discussing actually in Monaco, which again is a country that is not logically involved in the Arctic and the Antarctic, but it is very engaged in the polar regions because it will be so affected by sea level rise, and it is so
Yeah.
sensitive. And Prince Albert has a personal interest in the polar regions as well, and contributes a lot to it. So the focus for this next polar year is, I'll give you one project example that is a very big one that was spoken about in the Polar Symposium in Monaco. It's called InSync. And in the years 2028 and 29, they're doing the biggest global initiative of data collection of the sea ice, of the ocean, of the atmosphere, of the cryosphere, which is the ice zones of the planet, and of the actual ice core within the continent of Antarctica. They are using Arctic trucks, we are using drones, we are using sailing boats, we are using fishing vessels, we are using tourism vessels, and we're using foot as well to get the biggest collection of data over a set period of time so that we know what we are doing very definitively. And we can use that information to educate the rest of the world in 2030, 32 and 33 about the exact impact of the warming ocean currents heating the sea ice from beneath as well as from on top, so increasing the melt, and to get the facts really out there into the public domain. And another fascinating thing that came out of that meeting was we actually had a pre-event. There's an organization called UArctic, and it's all about educating the policymakers and the leaders of the future. Because if we're not doing that, we're almost calling on deaf ears, because I care about this, but in 50 years, I will be extremely old if I'm still alive. So I need to educate my children and my children's children about why they need to care about the poles in studies of humanities, not just science, right? So we had a very, very incredible group of people from Harvard, MIT, the White House, the Oceanographic Museum and China's biggest university, sitting around the table discussing genuine collaboration across universities so that the students of tomorrow learn about the poles and the importance of the poles. And that's starting, right now.
Oh, fantastic. So it really means it's not only about producing science, but actually it's the global academic collaboration and so on that actually shapes the climate leaders and decision makers of the next generation. So you're talking about you're looking ahead for the next generation and 2 generations, in fact. I mean, I'm probably not going to be around for that, but
legacy
legacy,
building.
yes. Yeah.
And, the only thing that was very intimidating for me personally was I was probably the only person in the room who actually came from a 20-year background in sustainable tourism.
Yes.
And I was probably the only person in the room who doesn't have a doctor or professorship behind my name. So I was secretly thinking, oh dear, I need to get a professorship behind my name. So maybe I'll go back to university myself. You're never too old to educate further, right?
No, but anyway, I mean, you are coming from the practical experience and to see it with your own hands and with your own eyes and your ears, and you personally experience what's happening. And I think that's so valuable. So, but in a world where geopolitical tensions are rising, how fragile is the current spirit of scientific collaboration in the polar regions, and what could realistically threaten it, if there is something?
So the I'll give you a little personal anecdote that may give you an indicator of that, the answer to that question. So we had a former advisor to the White House at the event, and he actually started speaking almost with an apology, saying, there are good people within our government that really care about the polar regions, that are doing incredible work and are continuing to do incredible work in this difficult political climate for our country in terms of climate change. So essentially, he started off by apologizing for a massive reduction in funding across Antarctic research, and it has been massive. In fact, the Antarctic, there was a study issued just a few months ago about Antarctic scientific research and studies, and China has overtaken America in terms of the volume of research they're doing. So there is an indicator of the geopolitics actually impacting the polar regions, not in a negative way. It's just a transition of means, essentially, right? But there's very good collaboration, and genuinely, Russians are sitting alongside Chinese, and obviously the Russians are having budget reductions, but they're still wanting to do the work. The boots on the ground of the people involved and engaging are very much collaborative in spirit. And, the Arctic is slightly different because it's about those land claims, and it's Norway and it's Canada and it's Russia. So, I would be disingenuous if I wasn't to say that, yes, there have been, I guess, the beginning murmurs of scrambles, and especially with the permafrost, which is part of another reason why we need to care about the polar regions. That area is warming at least 4 times more than the rest of the planet because of the permafrost being exposed, because of the sea ice melting. And it's also creating a new transport route for, ships, which further, damages the sea ice in the Arctic. So there's a lot of environmental impact going on very rapidly in the Arctic region, right now, which we need to be mindful of as a species, because it's having a big impact, right? Globally.
Yeah. So if the polar regions regulate the planet's climate system, should they be governed more like a global commons with shared responsibility, or will national interest inevitably reshape the future? What is your thoughts on that?
Well, I think in the case of the Antarctic Treaty, it doesn't actually expire in 2048, as many people think. It's just up for review again. So my hope is that with a lot of international and political pressure from individuals, it will stay. And that is my sincere hope. And part of my mission is I want to keep that incredible Antarctic Treaty in place. And ideally, of course, it would be wonderful to have a similar Arctic treaty, but it can't happen in the same way because it is not a continent. So it is down to, the high seas and the United Nations, and, there are very good international systems in place already that have to take more responsibility for the Arctic regions, because it's not just about, potential dredging of the Arctic to get whatever thing we need in, AI tech of the future. It's about discovering species that have not yet been discovered, that can have cures for cancer, and that can have cures for aging, that can, help humanity in very different ways than just, I'm not saying just, because I use AI as well. It's a part of life. But we have to be mindful of the impact of everything.
Yeah. So the way your activities have changed from being an operator, now you are involved in these meetings and the polar year and so on. We're just interested, how is your schedule? How is your program looking ahead for next couple of years? What are activities going to be like compared to what it was, let's say, last year?
Well, it's a massive transition for me personally, because I, co-founded a company called White Desert 20 years ago. and it was my baby, and I grew up with that business. And, I have 2 human children, but that was my other child, my baby. And it's now a teenager, and I'm very proud of what I achieved, and it will always be my baby. But, that baby nearly killed me in terms of pressure and stress.
Yeah.
And if you just think for a moment, operating logistics and aeroplanes and, wealthy individuals who, have very deep pockets, and you disappoint them if there's a storm or a hurricane. And it is, a very stressful environment to operate in. So there's a sense of relief that I'm no longer operationally involved in that. And I have a little bit more time to ponder what I really care about and what I really want to be involved in. And I care about the polar regions. So I want to try and make a difference and genuinely make a difference. I believe actions are far louder than words. And I also believe in piling on the hope pile. And I don't mean that in a naive way. I mean that in a proactive way. I prepared for this previous meeting in Monaco probably way more than I should have, because I did feel like I was the only non-academic in the room. But the other side of that coin is maybe I can add a different perspective to those environments. And I hope that I can enrich those environments with my experience, but also have a bit, as I said, a bit more balance in my personal life, be able to go for that walk up the mountain with my dog and, have a little bit more me time.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I can, even though I haven't, I worked in hotels, so I understand that it's a pressure when you have people who have limited time. They're going to have they have dreams of having the most fantastic experience, and something which is out of your control and their control, like the environment, then the things are not going their way, and they get a little bit impatient, and they're kind of looking at you at, what are you going to do about it? That's the feeling I had many times.
Yes. And actually, I believe 2 things to be true in those circumstances. Transparency and
Yes.
being honest is actually your only option. And I
Yes.
believe that for life as well. When I first spoke, you know, my first event, literally 2-3 days after selling my business, I found myself at the United Nations Ocean Conference in Nice with all the world leaders actually talking about ocean conservation. And I had to sort of put my hand up and go, I know about frozen oceans really well, but I don't claim to know about this. So you're always learning. And I think as long as
Yes.
you are evolving and you're able to be confident and vulnerable at the same time to say,
Yes.
I don't know this, but I will find it out. And you find
That's
it
right.
out, right? And I think that's, I have a very, very urgent sense of purpose in the world. And so that's, it's not really work when you really care about it.
No, that's exactly. It's not work. It's a whole different. You don't look at the clock and how much money I'm going to make out of it. It's more of a thing that you can accomplish something and contribute,
And I
isn't it?
also want to make my children proud,
Yeah, yeah. That's even more important. Yeah, yeah.
Mm, mm.
Good. So we are actually slowly moving into a segment called Off the Mic here, where we discuss more of the polar year, and I asked you kind of gently some personal questions, and now I'm going to have these what I call the quirky and fun questions, and it's part of it the human side, and it's also about operating in Antarctica. So bear with me. I know I haven't shared with you before, so if it looks like you're not comfortable, we'll just wing it, as you say it. So, if Antarctica could talk after the hosting thousands of luxury travelers, what do you think it would say about you as a host?
I know what many of my guests have said to me, because many of my guests have actually become dear friends. And I think that is a compliment. And I struggle with giving myself compliments. But the fact that a lot of them I'm still in contact with today from 15 years ago, and we have become very dear friends, and they ask me where they should go on holiday next, and, why should I care about, going to this island off Papua New Guinea, and I say, actually, the reason you need to care about this is this. And,
Yes.
Going to New Zealand, why should I, spend my dollars conserving this place? And I sort of say, well, actually, if you really want to know, they have a very amazing natural carbon sink there. And so you need to care about it for that reason, because it's the lungs of the ocean. So because I've developed trust with them over a long period of time, I hope that they would say I'm a valued friend and a trusted ally without a vested interest in trying to promote another thing. I'm just promoting what is right and what is good, in my opinion.
Very
So that's
good.
probably how I'd answer that.
Well done. What is the most unglamorous personal habit you had while running expeditions at the bottom of the world that your guests would never imagine?
Well, in the early days, we didn't have time or enough melted water to shower. So the ladies would tie their hair up in a plait and essentially leave it like that for months on end. And we used wet wipes to clean our bodies. So I think that's probably a thing that someone paying an exorbitant amount of money for a holiday in Antarctica would raise their eyebrows at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you were completely off duty in Antarctica, what were the small moments that made you feel most human, something that has nothing to do with luxury travel?
Definitely walking around an area called the Ice Waves, for me personally, was my favorite sacred space. And I would walk. So the ice caves are this extraordinary iridescent blue, and they look like waves. And I would go and sit there quietly and listen to my favorite song inside the ice cave and just close my eyes and be, grateful for the sound, the way it reverberates off the ice, and just gratitude for being alive and being privileged enough to be able to hang out there.
So that leads me to the next question. What is the genre of music you would be listening to there?
I'm a little bit of a classicist, and my son is a very talented piano player, which I think we spoke about the last time I was with you. He actually taught himself to play the piano during COVID out of frustration and boredom. And his pianist of choice is Chopin, so he's also a classicist. So I think I would definitely just listen to classical piano music is my favorite. Yeah, I know it's
Wonderful.
quite contradictory. I'm not a Taylor Swift girl.
I'm happy to hear that. So, if close friends, because you have made many friends during your 20 years, if those close friends could describe you in 3 words that have nothing to do with adventure, entrepreneurship, or Antarctica, what would they say?
Probably fun, hardworking, so like a perfectionist, and hopefully a great mum.
There you go. Very good. What is something about you that would genuinely surprise people who see you as a woman running who used to run the most extraordinary travel experience?
I'm a very private person in general. So, I suppose I've always been very guarded about my free time and how I expend my energy outside of work. I'm very, very close to my family, and I come from a long line of travelers. So, when I was 20, I'd been to close to 100 countries already. So I'm just a natural traveler. I could live anywhere, and albeit a tent or a, luxury resort.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, you are well traveled. I know that. That's nice. I mean, we have that in common for sure.
We
Okay,
do.
so what belief about leadership became stronger for you after only you started operating one of the most unforgiving places on Earth?
Leadership is something I've been pondering a lot lately, because the shape of leadership is shifting. And I'm witnessing that shift in my own time. And I think my children, I guess, leadership would have settled once again. The fact of the matter is, woman in leadership is a new phenomenon. It just is. Woman not so long ago didn't have access to the same education, the same jobs, the same pay. And I think the fact that is now genuinely shifting is there's a different sense of what leadership looks like. So leadership for me is collaborative, is extremely intense listening to the needs of your team. It is not about just having a convicted sense of direction and vision. It's actually about uplifting your team so that they do the work for you and you're there to hold them when they fall or, make a mistake, or hold them and lift them up. So I think it's almost, my view of leadership is almost the opposite of a patriarchal leadership paradigm where I am telling you what to do and you must do it. And what I do is irrelevant. Whereas I think I am the example and I have a responsibility as a leader.
Yeah, very good. Okay, just bear with me just a couple of questions here. So, what's one myth about Antarctica that always make you laugh?
Everybody always asks me if I've encountered a polar bear.
Yeah.
And the actual word Antarctic means no bear. The word Arctic means bear. And so that is always the first question. And then the second question is always about going to the loo on an expedition in Antarctica. It's always the question. And the answer to that is quickly and efficiently, because it's very, very cold. Yeah.
Yes. What's the funniest thing you have seen happening on these when arriving on the expedition? I call it expedition for lack of a better word. When people arrive there, what are the things that maybe that's the answer you had on the previous question, but there's certain things that you have seen that that makes me kind of laugh every time when you see it happening to the people who join you.
So quite often what I see, and this is not necessarily funny, but it's amusing to me, is this instant transition from high-powered, wealthy human, because you tend to have to be relatively affluent to be able to afford to go there. And it's this instant humbling. And I lovingly refer to it as, there's the humility moment where they are just, I am completely out of my depth here. I could die here. And obviously you can't, because you're very well looked after and you can fly out in the plane and you're safe. But it's that moment of, I am no longer in control. Nature is in control. Oh my goodness, what do you need from me? So it's that reversal of power, essentially.
Yeah. Well, Robin, thank you very much. This has been a great conversation, and thank you everybody who has been tuning into the Social Hotelier. If you enjoy this episode, please take a moment to leave us a review, give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. We have incredible lineup of guests coming your way, so stay tuned for more thought-provoking conversations like I had now today with Robin. Until next time, take care and keep exploring.
Thank you.